Of all of the texts of the New Testament, the book of Revelation is easily the strangest in more ways than one. Especially in the modern day, Christians have a reputation for a certain degree of paranoia, or calling the end times. This has occurred hundreds of times since the book's, quote, publication. Even Montanus, as early as the 200s, claimed that the end of the world was just around the corner, or the second coming was just around the corner. This is no accident. So then, the question becomes, what actually is going on with the book of Revelation? Is it like the other texts in the Bible? How might we approach this in a historistic way? And what I mean by that is to study how it would have been interpreted more akin to its own era of which it was written in, as opposed to looking back at this, perhaps missing certain crucial understandings, certain codices or cultural understandings that would better inform us as to what the text is actually doing. Now, this is not a summative matter. This whole deconstruction will not be an end-all be-all and a slam dunk in the way of closure when it comes to this. I know many speakers would love to tout such for themselves, but in earnest, we are all seeking to genuinely come to an understanding, an authentic seeking of understanding in an earnest fashion. And so accordingly, we can't handle all of it at once. We will have to deconstruct it through several different means in order to come to a greater recognition, but to claim a full frontal understanding, of course, is beyond measure. My last hedging is, throughout this deconstruction, I will likely most often call it the Book of Revelations, as it is more often the colloquial way of saying the Book of Revelation. So I want to begin this in an unconventional way, which is to talk about the text itself, not what's written in it, but the scholastic background when it comes to understanding the history of this text. And the book of Revelations isn't an isolated vision. It's a growth out from a tradition of prophetic and apocalyptic texts. These political crises that came up, especially in early Christianity. But that is intermixed with these more mythic archetypes. But then the book of Revelation seems to be an afterthought, an additional piece, a tack on in a distinctive sense, and tonally so much different than what came before it. When it comes to authorship, the claim is that this is John who's writing this. But when it comes to the manuscripts, the style is not like that of John. And so, at least scholastically speaking, the author of this is referred to as John of Patmos, as opposed to the one that wrote the Gospel of John. This has to do with the acquisition of the language that was given on the page. The writer of Revelation, his Greek was rough, and his Hebrew was rough. It was overall unpolished in style, in contrast to the Gospel of John. And this early interpretation of what the book of Revelation was doing was immediately apocalyptic to many. It was a direct reflection of Rome, specifically Nero's rule. This is the time period it is believed that the first manuscripts were written. The symbolism then of the beast and the reoccurring mention of Babylon is a direct reference to Rome. And we'll deconstruct this more later, but we'll just first acknowledge that at least to those that were first handed this text, this was more immediately applicable. This was not something that was moving to this great future era of an undisclosed time. Again, Montanus claimed very early that it was right around the corner. So the means to write this, we could say, would have been to subvert the language, to say that Rome was Babylon, to say that Rome is the beast, to say this outright in an era where Christianity was a victim, a martyr, the most disenfranchised among them. This would have been suicidal. So you do like the alchemists would do over 1,000 years later. You subvert the language, you make it encoded, you say things in a parallel way as opposed to an affronting way. And the nature of allegory in the ancient world is often just that. The wisdom or the direct message is hidden in the subliminals of the book. And that is the kind of classic Judaic style. The Gematria, as an instance, or the Book of Leaves, where the actual knowledge is not on the surface of the text. This is very well established and is not controversial to claim with regards to Abrahamic texts. A very substantial question here is with regards to the book's canonization. The history of canonizing what texts are the text of the Bible is a very layered, nauseating subject. But in the early eras, with these different groups that were seeking to put the book together, most often they omitted revelations. They omitted James. They omitted Peter. John was disputed. There was a brief instance around the year 400 where they put all these books together for the first time. And then it was omitted again, and then it came back again later. As to when exactly the book of Revelation was made canon, you could say that it was the Syriac canons, or you could say that it was the Council of Trent in the 1500s. Nonetheless, we should pay attention to the fact that this was not a text that was universally agreeable, and it making itself canonical was almost a hair miss. This was not, again, tonally or stylistically in the vein of the other text compiled. And again, it's worthy of emphasis. This is not canonical to all. The fact that it was not one of those core texts that was always unquestionably going to be included in all canonical Bibles, in all these different councils, says something. It says that it was one of these outliers. And one could argue that when it comes to this general understanding, that by the year 400, it was done. But nonetheless, I want to ask a greater question here. What if it wasn't included at all? Would Christianity still have this predisposition towards endlessly anticipating the eschaton? Would they still have this fervor about where this is all going? Or is the utility of the Bible and its story about Jesus in particular the genuine message that should have come across? And this anticipation of what will happen is an undercut. This is a genuine conversation in the theology of Christianity and in the history of Christianity. What this particular book does with its relation to the rest of the New Testament and the rest of the Old Testament, for that matter. As we've seen in the course, without the book of Revelation, we would have not interpreted the serpent in the Garden of Eden as the devil. That would have not happened. So then, if left to interpret it purely from that means, then how would Christianity look today? But this isn't a what if. It is in there. It has had this emphasis. So looking at the text once more, the tone of the Gospels and the epistles, this emphasis of mercy, love, forgiveness, preaching, service, spreading the gospel, ethical, community building, all this. And then you get revelations. You get plagues, beasts, dragons, bowls of wrath, judgments, a slain undead but still somehow living lamb, cosmic dualism. Its inspiration is clearly other than the main stretch that came before. It's nodding to this aforementioned apocalyptic tradition, i.e. Daniel, or even the Book of Enoch, or Ezra, or Daniel. The language it's using is imbibed with symbols, visions, cosmic battle of cosmological proportions, and eldritch figures in the midst. And even if we just look more singularly at Jesus, for instance, in the Gospels, Christ is a teacher and a healer. And then we go to Revelation, and he's a warrior and a king. Again, his characterization is almost foundationally different. These archetypes as well of the lamb and the rider on the white horse. This is all completely new to what we've seen come before it. The Gospels are more practical in this way, and Revelation is more mystical, more mythical, or more astrotheological. So early Christians then, you can see why then the canonization of Revelation was a hot button subject. Why church fathers debated if this violent imagery was befitting of Jesus and his message of peace. After all, this era was trying to decide how exactly or what exactly their truth was in this regard, or the truth was in this regard. Why not include the Book of Enoch? Why not include the Gospel of Thomas? Why are these other books apocryphal? And why is this book canonical? This is the conversation. Do we want this to be represented in this way? And again, the choice to include Revelation then, it's an interesting argument, how that must have come across. I suppose the argument must have been a pointing to Ezekiel. It must have been a pointing to Daniel, and to say that this must be brought back. And where else do you put it other than at the end? But in spite of that, it's changing this archetype of what Christ is. And it's developing a protest poetry-like vibe. This damnation element, as opposed to this calm instruction, this allegory, this almost mantra-like nature that comes from the Gospels. Now, I said that this was mystical, mythical, and potentially astrotheological. And this is where we really have to open up the scope of this historicity. We have to talk about the nature of religious texts and mythical texts from the past and from the era of which this was being written in. Writing was frequently nodding, mythical stories were nodding to the tracking of stars, sun, and moon, and the planets, the seasons, the harvest, migrations, celestial cycles. So much of myth is actually a story of exactly how to understand the heavens and where the constellations move. Myths encode these cycles. They give this knowledge in a way that can be remembered. It's a lot to learn how to circumnavigate where certain constellations are, where they'll be during certain seasons. And just to give the example of the hero's journey in this vein, it's being born at sunrise or at the spring equinox. It's maturing and coming into a triumph during noon or the summer solstice. It's declining or going through a sunset, and thus the autumn equinox. And then it's death during midnight or the winter solstice, and resurrection
at dawn or spring or on December 25th. All of this is a story of the seasons and what the sun and stars do in such. This hero's journey, this journey of the sun as it's been told, can be found in, of course, the story of Jesus. It can be found in the story of Balder, in Mithras, in Dionysus, in Osiris. They are all at the very least reflecting this ancient trope, or elucidating, emanating, representing this ancient trope of the sun's journey. The sun's journey. And Jesus says reoccurringly, John 8:12, I am the light of the world. He that followeth me shall not walk in darkness. He shall have the light of life. The sun, the light of this world. Matthew 24:27, for as lightning cometh out of the east and shineth even unto the west, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. The sun rises in the east. In Malachi 4:2, the Son of Righteousness arise with healing in his wings. The sun brings healing to the earth. The sun. Wings historically and mythically meant sunbeams, the beams of the sun, and thus why when you look at the ancient Egyptian iconography of the sun, it has wings. These are the rays. This is the righteousness of bringing life onto the earth, of clarifying through that darkness. Reflectively speaking, Jesus dies and rises on the third day. The sun is viewed historically, mythically, and in the sky to die on December 21st. And that leaves December 22nd, December 23rd, December 24th, 3 days. And then on December 25th, it's Christmas. It's the rising of the sun. The sun is reborn. And thus also why all these variant myths were appropriated by Christianity in the same vein. They all are reflective of that ancestral, mythical sun's journey. The word solstice etymologically means sol, the sun, stis, standing still. The sun standing still. And again, during the winter solstice, the sun does not rise an extra degree or fall an extra degree in its rotation in the sky like it does throughout the rest of the year. By our perception, it's like a limp corpse. But then, of course, on December 25th, it moves up for the first time since when? Since the last time it did that. This reoccurring cycle that happens every year, which is reflecting the sun's journey. So at the very least then, it's important for us to point out that Christ's resurrection mirrors the solar rebirth. And having 12 disciples is not a coincidence either. Matthew 19:28, ye shall also sit upon 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Jesus, the Son, is at the center of 12 disciples, the 12 zodiacal signs all circling around him. The 12 signs of the zodiac. They're all following the sun. Reoccurringly throughout the work as well, it's said that Jesus is the right hand of God, and something unmentioned, but one should always assume when it comes to these directional mentions in the Bible, is the assumption is that the person is facing towards the north. So then, if at the right hand of God would be where? East. East is where the sun rises from. The rising right hand of God coming out from the sky. This place of power is always at the right hand. The left hand of God then would be where the sun's setting. And that's a very different tone. So if every eye shall see him, right? We go to Revelation now. Behold, he cometh with clouds, and every eye shall see him. might we ask if this is sincerely an account of simply the sun? If in Revelation 22:13 it says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last, would this not also, in another leaning of the mind, be the sun? The sun that begins and ends each day of the year? I am the beginning and the ending? If his face shines like the sun, Revelation 1:16, and his countenance was as the sun shineth in his strength, how many comparisons would we need to make the case that this is a bit on the nose? That perhaps then the story of Jesus is a personified characterization of the solar logos, or the divine Son in human forms. The divine Son in human form. So then the zodiac is playing this 12-part cosmic play. Oh, and it just so happens to be that Hercules had 12 labors, perhaps through the 12 signs, or that Israel has 12 tribes, or that Jesus had 12 apostles.
This reflection of myth as it's mirrored into the astronomical cosmos is not distinctive in any sense. That's the point that we're elucidating here. The lunar goddesses, or the Virgin Mother, as it evokes the Mother Earth, which appears to birth the sun, as that is quite evocative of the Egyptian cosmology, but also simply acknowledging the nature of the gods, that each planet is named after a respective deity. Mercury, the messenger; Venus, love, beauty, war; Mars, simply war; Jupiter, king; Zeus, and Saturn being Kronos, time, and the devourer. This is not accidental then, that the heavens bear the gods. When it comes to the earlier reference of the Virgin Mother as well, this is reflective of the constellation Virgo as she appears where the sun is birthed from in December. It's the same area of the astrological sky, the constellation of Virgo, thus the Virgin Mother. Additionally, we should acknowledge the chaos conf trope here, in that Marduk slays Tiamat in the Sumerian myth. Hercules battles Hydra. This preoccupation with a serpent, a monster, which would be the constellation Hydra or Draco, being slayed by either, again, the predominant deity or a warrior deity. This as it's reflective of God in Leviathan, and then later in Revelations with Michael versus the dragon or Satan. This slaying seems to be a matter of the precessional shifts, the equinoxes moving. The constellation of Draco was the former North Star. However, as time has moved and the wobble of the earth has shifted away from that North Star, now we say Polaris is the North Star. Thus, the ancient myth of the dragon being slain. This is a constellatory reference and is a reference to the changing of the ages. This changing of this age, Draco being the North Star, would have been around the time of 3000 BC. So to continuously reiterate this story is either lost in its meaning or it's taking on a new allegory but using the same story structure. This might also clue us into the reoccurring flood myths. Noah, Gilgamesh, this water sign, the need to escape a water sign, the precessional equinoxes, the great year, the 26,000 year cycle of the moving of astrological ages. If we are now in the age of Pisces, then we are in that water sign era. We're in the ancient flood. We can speculate into these pre-Diluvian times when these ancient floods have occurred. Was it during the astrological age of Cancer, for instance? This is a means by which we could use to understand, not just simply to say that that's as simple as it is, but given our context and the mythology behind all of this, how so much of the mythology hints to the stars, then it's not crazy for us to come to this kind of means of interpretation. And so then comes the subject of the eschaton, or eschatology, end times myth. This tends to evoke reoccurring imagery. The stars are falling, okay? So meteors. The sun is darkened. It turns blood red. That's an eclipse. The heavens are rolled up like a scroll. This is the pole shifts. This is that wobble of the earth, the precession. This is reflective of not just Revelation, but Ragnarok and the Zoroastrian end time, of which inspired the many aspects of the Abrahamic and Christian lore. We have to then return to an ancient mindedness, an ancient sort of mind, in order to understand why this approach is so reoccurring, and also to place ourselves back into that historistic mind, of which would give us an accurate picture of Revelation, for instance. This mind believes that the sky is encoded with a story of which informs us how to rightly live. The ancients did not just simply build a monument, they built that monument under certain stars. They would not simply do a ritual, they would only do this ritual under certain stars during a certain season. These stories and these myths remind us of when to do these rituals and why they are done during these times. This is a cosmic science as it's interrelated with the subject of what is sacred. And in the ancient sense, what is sacred is what is special. And what is special is only during a certain time of the year. That sacred time where the sun dies only happens during the winter solstice. That's why it's sacred. It only happens during that time, and thus we only do this ceremony during that time. This is reflective all across the year, and this is reflective of all innate spiritual traditions. Ceremony as it relates to astronomy and as it relates to the seasons of the earth. These stories that come along with these ceremonies also inform us as to our morality, as to our morale, as to what we ought to do when within ourselves. If this is a great time for release, or this is a great time for reaffirmation, so forth. Accordingly, mythology, astrology, religion, astrotheology are all in the same bag. And they all encode seasonal cycles into their lore. They all utilize planetary archetypes. They all utilize the story of the precessional ages, i.e., astrological ages, acknowledge cosmic shifts as they change the world or end the world as it moves into a death season and then is reborn. This is the great cycle, and this is what the myths hint towards. The music of the spheres, so to speak. Myth is astronomy remembered in poetry. So let's put this into context. Let's elucidate this presence in the Bible proper. And from the gates, in Genesis 1:14 through 16, let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. It seems very on the nose to bring this forward in the beginning of the text. This word for seasons in Hebrew means appointed times or ritual feasts. To have a holiday, to have a holy day, would be like Passover. or the appointed time. These cosmic sacred times. Genesis 37:9, Joseph's dream of the sun and moon and of 11 stars bowing. It's a direct astrological image. And then to look greater yet at Passover, the Passover lamb in Exodus 12:3-6 is sacrificed in Aries season. The lamb is sacrificed in Aries season, the spring equinox. The blood on the doorposts could be a nod to the passing of the equinox, or the gate into the new year of light. Thus, the Exodus means a solar liberation. The pillar of fire of day and the pillar of cloud of night. God leading Israel by these pillars. The sky, once more, the sun and the moon. The pillar of fire, sun, the pillar of cloud, night, moon. And in Psalms and in the greater literature, this is, for instance, Psalms 19:4-6. In them hath he set a tabernacle for the sky, which is as a bridegroom coming out of his chamber, the sun's daily rising, the bridegroom being the sun. And then, of course, later in the New Testament, Jesus refers to himself as the bridegroom, once again affirming this likeness or sameness as the sun, literally. If we look then to prophets, it's a bit more encoded. For instance, in Ezekiel, this vision of the 4 living creatures, the lion, the ox, the man, and the eagle, this being the fixed signs of the zodiac. Leo, Taurus, Aquarius, and Scorpio being the eagle. This is north, east, south, and west. This is yet again cardinal direction, astrotheological, as it's using the constellations or the animals of the constellation to represent cosmic affairs. And then when we see the similar case in Daniel 7, the 4 beasts rising from the sea, why, yes, this is also astrological, zodiacal, and emphasizes in this case the allegory of empires. This will come up later. Moving on, the Jewish ritual calendar, the Passover being the spring full moon, the Pentecost being 7 weeks later, counted by moons, and the tabernacles being autumn equinox. This is on the nose. Thus, when you see these words used in the Bible proper, you should keep in mind that they could be or are nodding directly to these astrological sacred times. The Star of Bethlehem is observed by Magi, planetary conjunctions. This could be a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Pisces, which took place in 7 BC, perhaps. Jesus' ministry, then, is a solar allegory. He's born at the winter solstice, the light is returning, and is baptized at 30 degrees from that birthplace in the sky. Literally, the measurement of 30 degrees in that birthplace from the sky is Aquarius, the water bearer, or when the waters of new life are given to the earth. Again, 12 disciples, 12 zodiacal signs, and the death and resurrection at Passover, the solar equinox cycle. The age, then, is no accident either. This is the age of Pisces. Jesus feeds with 2 fish, thus why the symbol of Christianity are these fish, as this time of Jesus represented this movement into the age of Pisces, the astrological age of Pisces. I understand that people debate when exactly this happened, but conventionally speaking, it's year 0. The baptism in the water is an initiation into the Piscean age. Christ says, I am with you always, even until the end of the age. a strange choice of verbiage there. When Pisces ends, Aquarius begins by the nature of the precession of the equinox, and that's where we'll get into the debate of what exactly Revelations is saying later. Nonetheless, we have this lore overall in Revelation of beasts, falling stars, serpents, dragons, lambs like Aries, and New Jerusalem, which could mean the new age. This whole book then could be viewed as a mythic drama, which is elucidating or hinting at the very least from the Piscean age into the Aquarian age. And thus also when Jesus says, "Go forth with the man with the pitcher of water, go forth into the house of which he enters." This, yet again, being a nod to the stars, and yet again, the mythical basis for religious texts. So when we start paying attention to some broader themes, for instance, let's do some review. You have the 12 tribes, you have the 12 apostles, and you have the 12 gates of the city. These are zodiacal references. You have 7 spirits, 7 churches, and 7 seals, as they'll come up in Revelation. These are the planets, or perhaps are the planets, because the number 7 has been used for a lot. The cherubim have 4 faces, and those faces are the fixed signs of the zodiac. The heavenly ladder then could potentially be, or Jacob's ladder as many call it, could potentially be a planetary ascent through the spheres, the knowledge of this greater cosmos, this movement through the innate logoses of the world, of the universe. But then again, the Bible also says that the kingdom of God is within, but we'll tend to that a bit later. So at the very least, to really get into the mud here, to really start wrestling in a historistic way with the Bible, it requires astrological literacy. It requires a knowledge of astronomy. There are reoccurring references to certain constellations as well throughout the Old and the New Testament. If you don't know your stars, you don't know what it's saying. So without the knowledge of this astrotheology, the language of the Bible then is flattened or misread or confusable. And so when it's put front and center in such a way as Revelation is, where it's in your face, and it seems so weird and so abstract, it's again because of this astrological illiteracy. If Revelation encodes the shifting of the ages, then the Piscean, being that age that they were moving into, would utilize fish symbolism. And Christ would be the Lamb, the Aries to Pisces crossover. Aries is the Lamb. So thus the reoccurring image of the Lamb. Aquarius then could be the reoccurring references to the rivers of life, to nods towards universal brotherhood, to measured proportions, to the living waters, or even to the New Jerusalem. Let's talk a bit more about this Satan figure as it appears, because it's made one-to-one with the dragon or the serpent. It's named as such. This could be the constellation Draco, Hydra, a simple symbol for chaos, or Saturn. But here we're divulging Draco, the star in Draco that was our North Star on this planet, again back in 3000, 4000 BCE, was Thuban. This north celestial pole drifted away towards Polaris. So Thuban, this part of Draco, will be the northern star again. This is a circle, but it won't be the North Star until roughly 20,346. So it's going to be a good long while, but it will be banished, defeated, but will return eventually. Keep that in mind. The constellation Draco then appears in numerous myths because of its podium in the sky and its relevance towards certain seasons. Thus, the 12 labors of Hercules represents this movement through the zodiac. Draco in the labors of Hercules is Ladon, the dragon that guarded the golden apples in the garden of Hesperides. As part of his 12 labors, Hercules was to steal some of these apples, and he defeated the dragon with poisoned arrows and thus took the apples. Saddened by the loss, Hera, who had a part to play with the formation of the Milky Way, placed his image, the image of the dragon, in the constellations. This is katasterismos, the ancient act of making a constellation out of a mythical figure. There's another story in the War with the Titans where Draco opposed the goddess Athena. Athena slayed him, or more accurately, took him by the tail and threw him into the sky. Draco froze and had these knots in his body, and thus why the constellation looks like a knotted dragon. And of course, being frozen would go quite well with that Hyperborean, or the fact that the north is cold, and it was the North Star. In Persian mythology, this constellation was an evil dragon. This evil dragon that would devour humans. And so you can see how in the Middle East, the greater area of the Middle East, as it potentially mythically inspired the later Abrahamic traditions. Thus why the Draco constellation would be associated with evil. You see, these people would think that this constellation is evil, and so they would use the mythology to reflect such. However, this isn't the only beast in the heavens. The other constellation worth mentioning is Cetus, the great sea monster, or the whale. Now right away your mind might go to Jonah, and yes, that's very much at play here, but we should also mention this was the beast slain by Perseus in the Clash of the Titans. This is the beast sent by Poseidon after Cassiopeia boasted that her daughter Andromeda's beauty was superior to that of the nymphs. This beast slain by Perseus with the head of Medusa or otherwise was Cetus, the great whale. The beast Tannin in the Bible, Tannin in Hebrew, translated in Greek is Kytos or Cetus as it appears in Latin. This Tannin is the beast that God created, or is among the creatures created by God on the 5th day. These are the great whales. This is a very kind of niche, ancient mythology, the great whales. And so in this confusion of how to designate this beast as it moves across languages, sometimes it gets pushed into the characterization of a dragon. This conflation with Leviathan or Rahab. This Tannin, Leviathan, Rahab intermixture, as it all is confused around whether or not it's Cetus or whether or not it's Draco or Hydra. So when is Tiamat actually Draco? When is Leviathan Cetus, or are they all Draco? You see, this is the mess of trying to deconstruct the past. Jonah's great fish, though, is much more on the nose, the great fish that swallowed him. Greek as mega ketos, great fish, later becoming the whale or the belly of the great fish, or translated later as a whale. Not a great fish, but a whale, you see. Now, speaking of more speculative things, when is it nodding in these directions and when isn't it becomes the earnest question. For instance, the horsemen of the apocalypse in Revelation 6. Might we say that the white horse, meaning conquest, is representing Jupiter or Sagittarius, or perhaps that the red horse means Mars and Aries and thus the war, or the black horse, that is Saturn. Saturn's season is Libra season, and that's where the famines begin or food scarcity exists, and thus astrologically it would mean famine. Or the pale horse, which could be death, or the moon, or even a nod to Pluto or Hades, or the waning of the Saturn age, the Saturnian age, which would be closer to January, that Capricorn season. And so thus death, when things die in the barren cold of the winter, when nothing grows. So then the horseman would be a nod towards the negative attributes that come from the death season. Conquest, war, famine, death. War would often be a part of that winter season because that's when they would want to pillage. They would want to take over a village so that they could take what they had to survive better through the winter when nothing's growing. Satan then, if we're talking about confusion once more, designated as the dragon, is a question of when and what it's exactly pointing to. As mentioned, it could be Cetus, it could be most likely Draco or Hydra, but then Saturn gets a reoccurring use with the devil's not just symbolism, but also his kind of mirroring mythological parallels. Tiamat, Typhon, Apophis, these serpents that are reoccurringly the antagonists to God or the warrior deity. In astrotheological terms, Saturn, or Shani in Hindu, or Kronos, tends to be the accuser or the tester or the restrictive force. Saturn has always represented a kind of hard teacher, the slow groan of time, suffering as it becomes of you, negative karma coming back up. You can't escape the past ism. That's what Saturn is. But in the more hard-nosed mythology of it, Saturn is the god of sowing. It's all about the seeds, throwing out the seeds for time, and thus Kronos and Chronos being confusable, father time, and the sowing of seeds. This Saturn iconography often had him holding a scythe, which gives that reaping kind of motif, and thus our kind of darkness associated with death and the reaping. But then again, we wouldn't have food unless we reaped the crops, or then again, we wouldn't have meat unless death came to those animals of which we feast upon. Saturn then is this force of destruction, and his obscure partner, depending on the era, Lua, which meant plague or destruction. So Saturn, in the historical sense, had connections to plagues as well. He also had a connection with another goddess, Ops, O-P-S, which was the goddess of abundance. That's one speculation. Nonetheless, this is simply a god of the grain, the reaper of the grain, and also why the devil perhaps eventually wields a pitchfork in his cultural iconography, in his cultural representation, thus a greater reflection of Saturn. If The constellation Draco plays this part, and the constellation of Draco is dethroned, then it would be falling from the sky or falling from its post, and that is very reflective of the Lucifer story, being closest to God at the North Pole perhaps, and then being dethroned from heaven and being thrown down. I saw Satan fall from the stars. That's another quote, I believe, from Luke. Here then, we can see that this confusion of where exactly the Abrahamic tradition wants to point when it comes to the astrotheology of Satan. Satan then could be political, representing Rome's oppression. It could be mythical, representing the chaos dragon, or it could be more planetary, astrological, in the sense that it's simply Saturn and the negative attributes that came along with the mythic archetype of Saturn. So, in order to eventually dive more deeply into Revelation 2, we have to divulge Ezekiel and Daniel, because without Ezekiel and Daniel being present in the Bible, Revelation would have had no means to go about the moves that it pulled, mythically, and its strangeness and its rich allegory. And so Ezekiel, as a vision of the heavens, brings about these four living creatures, as mentioned, these zodiacal guardians, so to speak. The temple is measured by the angels, and angels as they could be interpreted as constellatory, how every part of the sky is measured, how every part of it is exactly where it's supposed to be, would be exactly the kind of stuff that the ancients would believe. It's no strangity then when we jump forward into Daniel, the four beasts, as they clearly are interpreted as empires, because Daniel tells you that that's exactly what they represent. These beasts represent empires. How much of a handful should we take from this lore-given interpretation of what the beasts mean? The Son of Man on the clouds in Daniel has been retrospectively understood as Christ, or the revelation. And then there's the echoing of the time cycles, these reoccurring uses of 3.5 years, or 42 months, or 1,260 days. But we're going to save the numerology for later. It's just to say, in a very over-summative way, that Ezekiel gives this kind of blueprint. It gives a kind of background to what would later become. Daniel then asserts this more political tinge into how you should interpret these astrological or strange allegorical apocalyptic texts. And so when Revelation is presented then, we have to look at what was built by Ezekiel and Daniel in order to properly deconstruct, you see. But this isn't the only relevant party here. There's all these other mythologies and religions that we should point to when it comes to understanding the greater context of this. And of course, we have to mention Zoroastrianism, as it propagated, created, inspired the Abrahamic tradition in its eschatology, in believing that there would be a, quote, final battle, a final event. Again, this isn't completely unfounded in the history of mythology. Ragnarok is an interesting inclusion into this, but when it came to direct inspiration, this was Zoroastrian, and this was a battle between good and evil, which featured resurrection and cosmic renewal. And then in Mesopotamia, there's the Marduk and Tiamat story, again, slaying the dragon in order to bring a new era, in order to usher in the future for new gods, or a new world, a new way of being, a new way of thinking. This was all brought about by slaying that dragon. And when that dragon falls from the sky after being slain, and the new North Star is put up there, that could just be a whole new era or a new age, you see. Babylon, then, is this archetype of oppression as it reflected into the past of the Israeli Judaic story. In Egypt, Isis was pursued by a serpent, and it also recalls this story of the woman clothed with sun. This will come up in Revelation later. In the Greek and Roman, this is Typhon, Hydra, Python, these ancient dragons, which are quite evocative of the dragon as it will appear in Revelation. In Hindu, Vishnu's avatar arrives on a white horse to destroy evil. Again, as we'll see later in Revelation, the rider on the white horse here will be Jesus. But in another story, it would have been Vishnu's avatar, you see. Once again, we're reflecting the story of Norse, the final battle, the dragon being there, slain by Thor, and the fall of the world, ultimately to be renewed. From the ashes it will be renewed. And then, of course, there's the more close to home references that would hint at these apocalyptic visions, which again, Enoch, Ezra, Daniel, Ezekiel. So there's so much background, there's so much to pull from when it came to the writer of this text. And this is a classic switch around. I mean, this is the MO, especially of later Christianity, when it comes to using that same mythology and just renaming it for purposes in Christianity. Instead of Tiamat, this could be Satan or the dragon. And instead of it being slain by Marduk, it's slain by Christ. Or if we go earlier, then is this not the same story of God slaying Leviathan? Or if we're Zoroastrian, then isn't this Ahura Mazda, or the god of the light, versus the god of darkness, Angramenu? You see, the names are just simply swapped here, but all the same story is retained. This isn't reinvention. I want to point out, too, that this is not simply mythical. If we take a page from the mystery traditions, if we take a page from more of the secret initiations, then the works of the planets, again, were reflective of the internal journey of you and me. These wandering stars represented different voices that would move through our heads as we are subject to different seasons. When it's winter, darker thoughts come over you naturally by the season and by the isolation and the hardy suffering that comes with the cold. Thus, you are embodying the cycles, or you are the very cycles of the world and of the planets, reflected by the planets, reflected by these wandering stars, the planets. And so when we speak of these mystery cults, Mithras, Dionysus, Isis, Osiris, whatever, it's a reoccurring story of initiation, death, rebirth, cosmic ascent, and ultimate victory of light over darkness. The dark night of the soul, as it consumes you and plunges you into nihilism, is said to give way to the albedo, the lightening, the victory of light over darkness. Is this not then reflected by the rebirth of the sun on December 25th? That victory of light over the darkness, when it looked like it would never come to be again, that the world would end because the years would not continue to be continuous, would not cycle over once more, that it could slip out of this cycle that we're in and the light would actually be consumed by the darkness. Apophis would swallow Ra, and the miracle that the sun picks itself back up and the light wins over darkness. If we are living in a dark age, if we're living in an immoral time where everything's degrading and the culture is being eaten away and all that we recognize is turning into this soupy soup, this darkening, would we not then tell a story
of the albedo, of how the light triumphs over the darkness, no matter how ominous and all-encompassing it seems to be. And so this is a greater reflection into philosophy, into mysticism. It interplays Platonic dualism, this, realm of shadows and this world of forms. It reflects Stoicism in the sense of this cyclical destruction, this renewal of self in the cosmos. It reflects this kind of Orphic Pythagorean motif too, because is this music of the sphere symbolism, shedding itself over into revelations? Is this mystical ascent of the soul actually the true work that is hidden underneath this biblical kind of codex? Is it not simply about the outer, and it is actually about the inner? And the early Gnostic groups would certainly speak to such. The, let's just say, first interpreters of all of this new text, of all this new writing that was coming out, ardent readers of the book of Enoch and such, their apocalyptic imagery, the archons, the cosmic rulers, this triumph over them was the gnosis, or to triumph over the darkness of material existence, to return the light to the pleroma. You see, this is all very reflective. The boundaries of these distinctive faiths is truly, truly messy. It's seamless practically. It's not this is Christianity and this isn't Christianity. At this level of interpretation, this all becomes the same story, the story of mythology, or the story of kind of astropsychology. If then, too, the Bible tells us that these beasts with the 7 heads, or these beasts in Daniel, are empires, then that's a one-to-one of not only the changing of the ages, but also the political powers of the earth as it is real for us. Not something of this great external cosmic play that the gods and whatever are just doing and we're all victim to. No, it's on the ground. It's Rome, it's empire, it's corporations, whatever. And the one that shows us how to be saved is how the Son is reborn and triumphs over darkness. This is just one way to go about it. So for a greater review of this kind of not talking about Revelations, but talking all about Revelations in the context of Revelation, it's to say that there's so much background that gave this all the means to come about. Not all the other, simply all the other faiths mentioned, but the mysticism, the Mithraism, and even in the Bible proper, the apocalyptic visions of Daniel and Ezekiel, Ezra, Enoch. These things all provide its blueprint. Zoroastrianism directly inspired this eschatology. The mystery religions and astrology, the Magi, give this astrological symbolism. This was directly inherited from the Magi, as they were very ardent stargazers, as the Bible even tells you so when it comes to the birth of Christ. They were looking for the stars. And so where did the Bible get all this knowledge of astrology and symbolism from? It was from the Magi, as they not only inspired its Abrahamic monotheism, but they also inspired eschatology, which is ultimately what Revelation is going to do. And this other subject of an empire that is oppressive, emboldened by the astrological alignments of the heavens, ultimately falling. This is protest literature, cosmic protest literature. But next, what we'll have to do is actually get into the book, actually do a kind of a play-by-play of how these chapters move.